Well, we're live. Welcome to this morning's e-Memoir session. This morning we're joined by Richard Curtis of the Mentoring School. And this session is also going to be led by Bees Kaczmarczyk of e-Memoir, looking at your learners from the National Apprentice Mentor Qualification, barriers to learning, mental health and life skills. We like to keep these sessions interactive as possible, so feel free to use a question or a chat facility to put any questions or thoughts to Richard and Bees, and indeed any of the other participants. If you're watching this video recording and you have any questions or thoughts for Richard and Bees, the contact details will be at the end of this webinar and also attached to the slides, which you'll all be receiving following the session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bees and Richard. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bees Kaczmarczyk of e-Memoir, and thank you very much for your patience. I'm being joined by Richard Curtis of the Mentoring School. Richard, do you want to say a few words of introduction?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, so I run the Mentoring School and our community for mentors, the International Mentor Network. We've been going about 4 years in different guises, and we're just going through the process of becoming an awarding body at the moment. We're a training provider providing mentoring courses.
That's great, thanks very much. And Richard will be leading most of the discussion this morning. We welcome as many questions as we can from you, as you can give us, and we'll try our best to answer them. And while Richard may lead the discussion, I will certainly be posing those questions to him. So keep those questions coming, comments coming. We want as interactive a next 45 to 50 minutes as possible. I think I just want to give us a sense of what we're going to be looking at. And I think it's important to, as Richard says, in terms of mentoring, how important mentoring is, particularly for newer, younger and less experienced learners. And as we're moving into the new world of apprenticeship standards and the levy and increasing the number of young people and adults that will access apprenticeships, I think it's good to focus a little bit on some of those key things that relate to the whole of the learner experience, whether that be the on the job, the off the job, and the mix of the two. And I think many of us have traveled a similar journey, so we understand some of the issues that learners face. I think the key thing that we're going to look at today, as Marek said, is look at from the learner perspective, having a look at learners. And very often when we talk about mentoring, we talk about technical, sort of task-oriented job skills mentoring. The theme is very much more around the whole picture, holistic support that learners need to be successful, particularly focusing on the pastoral. So over the next 45, thank you very much, Richard. Thanks very much. Then over the next 45 minutes, we'll be looking at some of the barriers to learning. We'll look at the mentor's mantra. Richard will explain some of the issues around the way the brain works, particularly the link to emotional intelligence, but also some of the key behaviors and emotional experiences that underlie all of those different responses and all those different experiences that our learners have. I think it's also important to appreciate that learners can sometimes have a combination of difficulties, and Richard will be focusing on that. But at the same time, we'll be starting to hint at some of the approaches that we can use to reduce some of the barriers to entry and obviously to learning, and those obviously will be picked up in future webinars. So that's very much the agenda for this morning. Richard, could you just sort of give us some idea of and some sense of the sort of barriers to learning that you've come across?
Absolutely, and I mean, we work with workplace mentors as well as on-program tutors and assessors when we're delivering this course. And so from both sides of the fence, we often see similar barriers. Things like, I mean, I'll put it there, inability to adjust learning styles, particularly if someone's been disengaged with secondary or further education, and so often they haven't gone through those final few the learning stages of understanding about the different learning styles and understanding how to apply them in different contexts, because the whole concept that we have one preferred learning style is a load of bunk and has been debunked years ago. But unfortunately, many people are still of the opinion that actually this is how I'm going to teach the skill and I'm not going to vary it, and so therefore one thing that we see often is that mentors often have to support an apprentice to understand how to adjust their learning style to suit what's happening in their workplace.
And Richard, are we going beyond the sort of traditional VAC, visual, auditory, kinesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, very interestingly, the visual auditory kinesthetic, the VAK model, has actually been updated to include an R now. So you've got visual for watching someone do something, you've got auditory for listening to someone describe something, and you've got reading and written for actually reading about something or writing about something, and finally you've got kinesthetic, which is learning by doing. Now, actually, they identified in a review probably a good almost 20 years ago now, so sort of somewhere between 15, 20 years ago, and they identified that R was an important part of the process. But actually what's really interesting is what we know from the ability to do ECGs more recently and scans of the brain and things, is we know that actually the brain adapts its learning style depending on what resources it's got available. And so anyone who's trying to just say, well, you're a visual learner, therefore I'm only going to teach you by visual learning, is actually doing their learner a disservice, because they've got to learn how to adapt those learning styles.
Yeah, and you've also, in that list, you've highlighted some of the things we're going to talk about in terms of mental health barriers and life problems. What do you mean by not fitting in? How does that act as a barrier?
So one of the things that we can see, that I've seen both in SMEs but also in large businesses, is where an apprentice just hasn't understood the workplace ethos, and either sort of misaligns themselves or almost sort of attaches themselves to I'm going to say the wrong person in a large team, as a bad influence. I can remember going back some years to my work experience. I mean, we're going back 20 odd years now, but I can remember that I started hanging around with one of the employees who I thought was quite cool. We went out for lunch one day. We got back late one day because he was directing me, but actually that affected my my end of placement report. And so there's a situation where you just end up hanging around with the wrong person. It could be that we all know of some workplaces where it's very cliquey and it's very hard to fit in, and sometimes some of the issues that come up in mentoring is that an apprentice can feel excluded from what's happening in that workplace.
Yeah. We've actually a good question coming in, by the way, just to about taking account of learning strategies rather than just learning styles, and that's something that you've accommodated, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, it's something we talk about. It covers a whole module in the full course when we run the full course, because actually you've not only got, as I say, the traditional VARK model, but you've got people's approach to assimilation of knowledge, how they remember it and things like that, and that comes into a lot larger field of learning strategies, as it were.
And a point, maybe a comment here from Lee, saying that, very often that a lot of these things haven't been identified in secondary education, and we meet those learners for the first time in an apprenticeship or in some kind of other training environment, and sometimes we have to spend a fair amount of resource and time engaging and making sure that we make those adjustments to accommodate their individual needs.
Absolutely. I'd completely agree with that, and that's where mentoring does come in, and a mentoring approach, because the way a mentoring approach works is you go into a session with an apprentice or with a mentee without an agenda, and you're there to listen to whatever issues they've got. When you take a mentoring approach as particularly at the start of induction and start of the relationship, actually that does give often those, I'm going to say, those disengaged or those dissatisfied learners a chance to be able to talk about their experiences and chance to be able to share those things, because actually if you don't give them that opportunity, then yes, it will often come out as something to do with performance, which is something we've obviously got there later on, which is obviously about the output of their work, the output of their coursework, but also performance can also relate to their workload as well. And I've recently just been talking to a mentor who was supporting an apprentice who, because of various absences and all the rest of it, they'd ended up covering a whole load of other people's work, and they weren't getting their 20% off the job. They weren't doing any of the apprenticeship stuff because they were too busy holding the fort for everyone else, basically, and they hadn't realised kind of the knock-on implications. And because the work was being done, the more senior management hadn't realised this was an issue.
Yeah, and another comment's coming through on life problems that, in addition to the sort of what we've talked about, is that they're working predominantly with older apprentices, more mature apprentices that often have quite significant family responsibilities. And so there's a lot of issues around their ability to learn because they've got other priorities, as well as having it been some time since they've actually been in formal learning.
Absolutely, absolutely, and this is again something we see our people that we've trained going out and supporting, particularly through the levy. Obviously, many employers are looking at upskilling their existing staff with maybe leadership or management or different apprenticeships. And actually, yes, what we are seeing is older apprentices coming through who haven't thought about their learning styles for many years, have got external pressures. I mean, I've got a son who's now 16 months old, and I'm also alongside running a company, I'm also doing a PhD in my spare time. Now actually I do know that as he's been going through teething and all the rest of it, it's completely affected my performance as I've got less and less sleep, for example. And there's a very simple life problem for an older apprentice, let alone the more common ones that we see with the younger apprentices.
That's great, thank you. And I mean, we certainly empathise with you, and certainly Marek does with a 2-week-old baby here, so he appreciates that. So,
congratulations, Marek.
Thank you. In terms of understanding, well, congratulations to Marek. In terms of those barriers to learning, obviously through the work that you do in the mentoring school, you will be devising different strategies to deal with each one of those, to address each one of those different barriers.
Yes, absolutely. So what we'll do is as part and parcel of the training that we provide, is we'll talk through the common difficulties, and we'll talk about how we as mentors can support I would say support the apprentice to help them to I'm going to say action plan themselves, to take responsibility for what they're going to do. If they're going to ask for extra support, if they're going to, for example, let's say they suspect they might have undiagnosed dyslexia, for example, then actually one of the things we could do is offer to signpost, but ultimately it's down to them to make that decision about whether they want us to do it or not. That's the big difference with mentoring compared to other management or leadership styles. Actually, with mentoring, it's about the mentee making the final decision about what the next actions are.
Yeah. So in terms of the sort of basic mentor mantra, what are these 4 stages? What do they mean?
Right, so the mentor's mantra is a way of structuring a very open and clear mentoring conversation. And so it's the first step is always, and as with any kind of difficult conversation, but with most conversations, is about making your mentee feel safe. So things like making sure that you're sat down somewhere you're not going to be interrupted, making sure that you're starting on time, making sure that you're not late, that if you are running late, that you have phoned and warned them, making sure that actually that they've been released for the duration of your session, that they're not thinking about all of the things they've got to go back and do, even down to trusting you and finding that basic common ground to start off with, because psychologically speaking, and we'll often when we meet someone, and Beej, you and I have done it last time we met at a conference, we always start a conversation with a little bit of small talk, maybe about the travel, maybe about the weather or something like that. And what we're psychologically doing is we're finding some common ground to almost test the relationship, to make sure that we are safe and secure with each other. And for a mentor, they're going to have to do that in every single session. Just make sure that they start off with a very firm, trusting relationship before they move on to anything else.
Yeah, and I mean that starts to raise another issue, Richard. We've got a comment here. My significant role as an assessor tutor doesn't always allow me the time for this pastoral relationship to develop. It tends to be much more around, assuring that we get through the standard or the framework.
Yeah, and that's where moving from framework over to standards is obviously less is a lot less focused on the tick boxing, and a lot more focused on what we can put in place within the context of our time, obviously, to support the learner. to be moving forward towards their endpoint assessment. And that's a really big shift. And I know that there's many on-program staff who are struggling with that shift because it's a complete new method. I mean, an example would be recently I was talking to someone who had a meeting with a manager about a learner who wasn't doing their coursework. They decided the outcome of what the learner needed to do, and then the assessor went to go and meet with the apprentice to explain the plan to them. And that wasn't a mentoring session. That was far more of a management session. But it's really important that as we do this shift from framework to standards, that people could become more aware of these differences and make conscious decisions about sometimes we're not going to be able to have an open, clear mentoring session. Sometimes it's going to need to be a developmental mentoring session, which is where you do feedback on performance, for example, things that you've observed, and actually use your experience to guide the apprentice forward. And other times actually it's going to be more of a I'm going to say more of a management conversation where it's about meeting those expectations to do with the course, as it were.
And what's the difference between it's all right to think about it and it's all right to talk about it?
Now, this is interesting because actually what we're getting to here is once you've got a trusting atmosphere in your mentoring session, then actually the way to start is to ask a very open question. You know, how have things been? How are you getting on? And then to be silent, because actually what we need to do, and as humans we're really bad at this. What we need to do is we need to make it all right for our apprentice or for our mentee to process their thoughts, to think about how things are, whatever blocks or barriers they've got at that moment in time. And eventually, if we let if we let them own that silence, if we stop ourselves from interrupting, stop ourselves from saying, oh, what about such and such, or what about such and such, if we hold back on that, what you'll find is people are able to process their thoughts and actually then start to talk about whatever's actually bothering them. Now, that's when you first start out, it's really hard to do because we abhor silence. And so often when you see an apprentice sat there in silence, you'll start suggesting things to them because you think, oh, they're struggling with whatever I've asked. But actually, if they were struggling with whatever you've asked, they would tell you, I don't get what you mean, or they grunt at you or something like that. Actually, if they're sat in silence, it means they're thinking about it. So it's a really important, again, it's a difference between mentoring and other styles, is that actually we're using silence to give permission to the mentee to be able to think about wherever they are, be able to talk about it. And only once we've gone through that stage, we've listened without judgment, can we then start to share a bit of our experience, suggest some things they could do so that they can agree a plan.
And I think that raises a very interesting question, and Helen's already posed it as well as Gordon. Thanks for your questions. Helen poses this question at this certainly, when you start talking about this, developing this mentoring role, both in terms of the technical mentoring, which I think we're more familiar with, but increasingly, as you said, this more holistic pastoral, is what does this mean for the continuing professional development of our assessors? And Helen, I'm sure she's airing something that several other people have already said. This does mean that our assessors, our assessor tutors, certainly have got significant development needs of their own.
Absolutely, and originally the National Apprentice Mentor Qualification was developed for workplace based assessors and mentors originally, but actually more recently we've worked with a few training providers to develop an on-program, so tutor and assessor version of the course for precisely that reason, because it is a whole new skill set and it's a whole new way of working. And it's really hard when you first start talking about it. It's a really hard shift to start making in your head, and so that's the reason that obviously the course is being I'm going to say so successful at the moment, because people are recognizing that level of CPD is needed.
And certainly to support what Helen just said, several people, Helen, have agreed with your comments there. What about when you engage with an apprentice in terms of this form of intervention? How important are cultural differences? Do you think that comes into it?
Oh yeah, I mean, you're getting onto the realms of diversity now, because actually you've got cultural differences, so things like background, ethnicity, religion will all have an impact on the way that you approach. You know, an example would be maybe a very devout female Muslim, for example, would struggle with a male mentor, I suspect. I mean, you've obviously got the religious aspects as well as the cultural things. These are absolutely huge. And the other factor with cultural differences is the workplace culture as well. An example would be, I'm sure you may have heard of the awful situation where an apprentice at an Audi dealership was set alight, after bullying, but by the workforce, and now and he ended up or tragically, killing himself because of that bullying. Now, actually, that's the sort of thing where the culture is toxic, and it's the sort of thing that a mentor, especially an external mentor, is likely to pick up and sort of flag up. But in that situation, there wasn't that level of support given.
And these workplace issues, that's an extreme you've just described, but there will be a lot more that we will be familiar with. What's what's Generation Y and Generation Z? What does that mean?
Oh yeah, well, that's why I was going to start, because there's a huge shift going on at the moment. So I mean, I'm young enough that I'm the first year of a millennial. I'm proud to say. So I was born in 79. So anyone born from 79 through to the early 1990s is a millennial, and that basically means that we came of age around the millennium. We started going out into the workplace around the millennium, and so what's happened with my generation is, you'll notice traditionally we're very we challenge authority, we challenge existing systems, we challenge the way things are done, because we've seen the rise of technology, we've seen that there are other options, and actually we say, well, why don't we start looking at this? Why don't we start exploring this? Why don't we start looking at technology? Whereas Generation Z is, so anyone that's born after about 95, 96 through to about 2010 is Generation Z. And Generation Z, throughout their whole life, basically they've been born with a device in their hand, so they're used to multitasking, they're used to flicking between things. They've probably always got Facebook open in the background, they've probably always got music or some kind of podcast or something playing in some headphones or something like that, because actually what's happening there is they're so used to the fast-paced nature of technology that needs to be fed all of the time. And now when it comes to comparing that with the older stuff, if you go back to the baby boomers, and then we could even talk about sort of, we could go all the way back to the greatest generation, so the people that were raised during sort of the post-war era. You then moved into the baby boomers, who were the generation who rebelled against the rationing and the tightness and of the greatest generation. And then you've got the lost generation in between all of these. So in between the baby boomers and millennials, you've got the lost generation, and this is the generation where actually by this point many it was common for both parents to be working, so they were known as the latchkey generation. They'd often go home from school and let themselves into an empty house, for example, and they became known as the lost generation. Now if you look at the way the work ethics of the older generations compared to the younger generations that I've mentioned, actually a big one is for filing. What is the relevance or the importance of filing or paperwork? When actually everything can be digitized. Whereas, as we all know, that if you're in a large employer, there's a huge amount of paperwork, and part and parcel of an apprentice's role is likely to be some form of admin and some form of filing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that certainly comes through in some of the comments that are being made about how that workplace diversity could be very, much more than any young person might have been accustomed to, say, in their school or training establishment before, particularly in terms of working with older workers and people from different backgrounds. So I think key things to be borne in mind there. Lee's just suggested, by the way, something that we'll come on to later on when we start to look at some of the individual situations that learners find themselves. He suggests that there's 2 very good level 2 qualifications available from NCFE: the Certificate in Understanding Specific Learning Difficulties and the Certificate in Awareness of Mental Health Problems. E-learning programs that he's found very useful. So again, thanks very much for suggesting, as we go through the webinar, different ways in which we might address some of the issues raised by Richard this morning. Anything else you want to say on diversity, Richard?
No, so I mean, the only other things really quickly is obviously there's a huge thing about gender at the moment. You know, I know there's a big push within the apprenticeship sector to obviously push women towards STEM and things like that. You've got the wage divide and all the rest of it. Big issues around working parents, whether they're young or old, and huge issues with NEETs, those that haven't been in employment, educational training, and the long-term unemployed often come with extra anxiety, extra depression, and other baggage, as it were. And so actually, again, this is all reinforcing the need for a more pastoral approach to support rather than a procedural approach that may have been used in the past.
And there's an additional comment there which doesn't relate directly to apprenticeships but to traineeships. It says that I work with 19 to 24 adults who have often been unemployed since school, and there are major issues in addressing their individual needs, especially within a mixed group with younger trainees. So I think that's something you've borne out, especially when there's several generations of worklessness in the family as well.
Absolutely, and the intergenerational stuff. You've got things like you know, social anxiety. You've got things like agoraphobia that all come into that, or perceived agoraphobia, perceived anxiety as well can be another thing. So it can be learnt. It's just like, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about OCD later, but OCD is an anxiety problem that is learnt initially, and then becomes obsessive. But yeah, it's very interesting. But I mean, we cover all of that in a lot more detail on the course, but obviously we need to keep moving from the point of view of time.
So you've got some examples here of some young learners, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to chuck in a couple of examples of young people that I've worked with over the years. I mean, Ian there, he's 16, he's very bright. He comes across as very bright. However, his work is very average. He completes his tasks at a slow pace, and he shies away from direct questions. Now, and likewise, he's not building much of a bond there with some of his colleagues, as they don't know how to encourage him. Now, Ian is an example, and again, this is something we will go into more detail in the course, but Ian is an example of the way to build a relationship with Ian is to actually be able to be in a position where you're sat side by side, looking at something together, and so you work on something together in a supportive way, and that's how you build the relationship. Because when he's asked a direct question, he shies away from that. He shies away from the direct relationship with people. So as a mentor, if you think about the first step of the mentor's mantra, we'd struggle with building that relationship if we didn't focus on something in order to build that relationship based on a shared experience.
And for Wendy?
So Wendy, on the other hand, so this is interesting. So Wendy has a stutter, finds it difficult to speak in full sentences. Her condition worsens in situations where she feels under pressure. It's having an effect on her relationship with colleagues. Now, I'll put this in because actually, with Wendy, actually the solution was that she came up with. Wendy's obviously not her real name. But the solution she came up with was that she wanted us to run an awareness session for her colleagues, so that they stopped interrupting her when she was starting to stutter. The worst thing that you could do for her was try and second guess what she was going to say, and so actually that increased her stress levels, and then she made the stutter worse. And so what she wanted was almost to educate her team with, this is how to handle me. And so it wasn't about supporting her at all. It wasn't about building the relationship with her. It was about actually, this is about a wider education piece.
And I think that highlights something that's already come up in a question. We're getting loads of questions, by the way, so this is good. There's a thank you for explaining the difference between Generation Y and Generation Z. But there's quite, you know, when we talked about having different generations in the same group, does it mean we have to have different approaches to those generational differences in say a workshop or a classroom situation?
So it's more about how you justify it. So actually, I mean, for example, if you look at let's say some of the more I'm going to say, I nearly said elderly staff then, but the older staff, actually they'll understand. Let's talk about filing. They'll understand the filing has to be done. It's just part and parcel of an admin job. You just have to go and do it. Whereas for a younger generation, you're going to have to sell it to them. You're going to have to, there's going to need to be almost some kind of incentive, because unfortunately, what's happened in terms of their brain development as they've grown up, they've been used to immediate rewards. They've been used to technology giving them immediate feedback and all the rest of it. Now, if they go and sit in, like I did when I first started, I worked for the civil service when I first left college, and I used to go and spend 2-3 hours in the filing racks on our floor, because I worked in personnel, just doing the filing, and it was incredibly tedious and all the rest of it. But actually, if you look at younger generations, they're going to need to break that up. They're going to need to have some kind of incentive for doing it, and so it's about how you sell it to them that I would say is the big difference.
And taking account of the differences, then can you just explain a little bit about how the brain develops?
Yeah, so very quickly, and there's a reason we were doing this. It's to do with emotional intelligence. So here's a picture of my brain. It's just proof that there is something in there. Now, if we look at, so if you can just do the first 3 clicks for me, perfect. Now, this is the brain stem. This is the base of the brain. You've got the medulla oblongata, which is the part of the brain that deals with automated body functions, for example, heartbeat, breathing rates, and all the rest of it. You've got the cerebellum, which tells the body how to act. If you're going to move your arm, it's the cerebellum that issues the order. And you've got the pons, which deals with connecting the 2 halves of the hemisphere. Now, this is known as the reptilian brain, and this is kind of the lowest level of brain. Then, if you don't mind, just clicking forwards just 2 for me, and then you've got the mammalian brain, the animal brain. And so this is the emotional brain. This is the bit. So the thalamus is the part of the brain where all information is received, basically, and the thalamus decides where it's going to go. The thalamus says, oh, this needs to be dealt with by the frontal lobes because it needs some reasoning. Likewise, actually, this is an emotional response, therefore it's going to go to the amygdala. And the amygdala, we've got 2 amygdalas either side of the brain, and they deal with or they react to the emotional hormones that are released, and that's basically your emotional center. And then if you click through the rest, you've got the occipital lobe at the back, deals with vision and eyesight. Parietal lobe, or just a bit too far, at the top, parietal lobe deals with physical sensations, physical movement, tactile sense and things like that. And you've got the temporal lobes at the side, they deal with order, long-term memory. And at the front, you've got the frontal lobes. Now, this is where your personality is. This is where your judgment-making skills are. This is where your decision-making is. This is where your ability to form a sentence is all constructed in the frontal lobes. They're absolutely huge. Now, this is really important because what happens during puberty, and we know that this extends up until mid-20s now, is the frontal lobes and most of the final bit of the human brain that we just spoke about there actually shuts down so it can be rewired. And so if you just want to click onto the next slide. Oh, well, that's a bit worrying. I'll just talk through it. I'll just talk through it whilst you sort that out. And so what we see, if the frontal lobe isn't accessible because it's being rewired, and it's actually the last part of the brain to be rewired during puberty, so we're talking sort of 16 through to about 24 it's being rewired, then actually what happens is someone's more predetermined to have an emotional brain response rather than a reasoned, rational response, which is why if you think about teenagers and their inability to cope with stress, inability to cope with any kind of social demand, inability to make judgments, anything like that, is all basically gives you an emotional brain response. That's why you get the grunting. That's why you lose the eye contact. It's why you get the very dramatic Kevin-like behaviour. You know, going back to Harry Enfield and Friends, it's why you see all of that during the teenage years, because actually what happens is the human brain in effect shuts down. And this is huge. This has a huge impact, and certainly for many of our younger learners, as I say, all the way through to the mid-20s, they will still be going through the latter stages of that. Now, Beach, have I lost you?
I think, no, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Oh, you're still there. Excellent. We just lost the PowerPoint.
I think the PowerPoint's gone into. I'm not quite sure why that's happened, but what I'm going to suggest is, if we've still got the slides will be available to our listeners. So if you wanted to move on to, you've described the next bit. Do you want to move on to perhaps some of the conditions that we might come across?
Yes, I'm just going to talk about, if it's all right, I'm just going to talk about some common mental health conditions that we'll also come across. And at any one time, with the conditions that I'm going to be talking about, we are talking probably in around, in the region of about 10% of our learners will be experiencing one or other or multiple of these mental health conditions. The first one I was going to raise was the most commonly diagnosed mental health condition in teenagers, which is ADHD. Or ADD. We see ADD, or attention deficit disorder, less diagnosed in Britain. We see attention deficit hyperactivity diagnosed a lot more. This is obviously relevant because actually anyone experiencing ADHD, which you can't overcome, it's an organic thing, it's not developmental. So when psychologically, if we talk about something organic, that's to do with the way the brain is wired. If it's developmental, it's something that's happened as a result of our DNA, but combined with the environment around us. And so it can often be overcome. So with ADHD, it's organic, you're never going to change it, and medication can help, but other times it doesn't necessarily help. And so if you've got an apprentice with ADHD, then it can be very difficult for them in the workplace to be able to sit still. They're going to need frequent breaks. They're going to need reasons to move around the office, even if they've got a desk-bound job, all of these sorts of things. And very often you'll find, hopefully, provided they've been diagnosed by the time they get to you, that you might find they go towards the more vocational roles as a coping mechanism, and less towards the, I'm going to say, the desk-based roles. So that was.
There's a question just there. We've got the slides back up, so don't worry about that. Can you all see them? Can you see them, Richard?
Yes, I can see them.
Yeah. One question that's just come up in relation to what you've just said there is, and it's again from, I think, very much from an assessor's point of view. I might recognise this, but I haven't got the skills or the tools to be able to address the issues. What do I do? I think it's a good question, isn't it?
So this is something the bit I'm talking about, the bit I'm talking about for the next 5-10 minutes is something we cover on our course for about 3 hours. We go into it in some depth, because actually, as with many mental health conditions, often it's about adapting or supporting the apprentice and the workplace to adapt to those needs. And so, like I've said, for example, it might be that they need frequent breaks away. And so part of a mentoring conversation with the apprentice might be, about whether it's beneficial for you to have a conversation with the manager about, a three-way conversation about ways that they could adapt themselves to support. ADHD is a diagnosed disability, and so you start getting into the Disability Discriminations Act if they don't, obviously. So it's very often what we find is, even if they've been out of education, very often by the time they get to you, they've started to learn or to recognize what their coping mechanisms are. And so actually, from our point of view, it's about supporting them or acting on their behalf as an advocate to make some changes in the workplace.
And it's an interesting point there, Richard. A good point from Helen here. in relation to the way the brain works and it's wired, and what we're doing in terms of addressing the needs of individual apprentices in the workplace, she says that this is particularly adding to the formative assessment of behaviours in the workplace. It becomes even more important that we know the learner, not only as assessors, but also as from the employer's point of view. This could worry assessors. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that absolutely backs up the whole reason we developed this training, was because we recognise that as we shift from framework to standards, that formative assessment and the support that goes alongside it, so the pastoral support that goes alongside it, is going to be absolutely crucial. I mean, not obviously. I mean, you're probably talking sort of a good 60-70% of apprentices won't need that additional layer of support as deeply, and may not need as intensive mentoring after the induction period of the first 3 months. But if you look at those with, I'm going to say, hidden conditions like ADHD, then actually, yes, that's where support mechanisms and styles of mentoring rather than managing learners is very different.
Yeah. And what about people on the spectrum?
Right. So yeah, it's a spectrum. So this does include Asperger's now. Years ago, they used to diagnose Asperger's as separate from autism, but actually then they've now recognised that on a scale of white to black, Asperger's is kind of light grey. So autism is a real range going through. And so, we can see it at one end where actually people are quadriplegic and actually then very unable to respond. But we are likely to see it in apprenticeships because higher level, high functioning autistic people very often will follow a career that's to do with their interest that relates to the autism. So, for example, I've seen some apprentices that have gone into the train industry because they're obsessed with trains, and same with buses and things like that. And so you need to be aware of that because obviously for someone who is on the autistic spectrum, they live a very rule-driven life, and so that can lead to many social difficulties where they break etiquette, they ask inappropriate questions because they don't know it's an inappropriate question, all of these sorts of things. And again, because it's an organic condition, then part of our work is about ensuring that the workplace understand their needs, as well as giving our mentee the strategies that, in order to be able to avoid these things happening.
Okay, and can we move on, Maz?
Right, yes, so very quickly, obviously anxiety, there's a whole broad spectrum of anxiety disorders. You could be talking about general anxiety disorder, you could be talking about panic attacks, you could be talking about phobias, you could be talking about social anxiety, work-based anxiety, particularly if someone's feeling insecure or threatened, maybe their performance hasn't been that good or they're worried they're going to get sacked or something like that. We may see that they develop a work-based anxiety, and so display physiological symptoms, in the morning, or start a pattern of sickness starts, for example, and all these things. And it goes all the way through to obsessive compulsive disorder, which begins as very often as an anxiety condition where actually we're concerned something is a threat to us. It might be germs, it might be that we're concerned there's going to be a fire, hence the making sure that all the plugs are off, all the light switches off, and things like that. And again, very often, if someone is experiencing anxiety disorder, when we're working as a mentor, they'll offer, it's about giving them the space to be able to talk about what helps them, what reduces their symptoms, basically. And so again, that's why I was bringing it in here. It's something that maybe may not have come up as a traditional assessor, but actually as we move forward, it may be something that becomes an issue, becomes a barrier in the workplace that we may end up needing to just be aware of.
And there's several more that we'll be looking at if we move on to the next in terms of depression.
Yes, move on very quickly. Sorry, depression. So there's two major types of depression. There's situational based depression and there's major or clinical depression. Situational based depression is does what it says on the tin. It's where the situation is causing the depression. So maybe the stress, maybe the social situation, or whatever it is causing the depression. The solution to that is obviously to resolve the situation. Whereas clinical depression is where there's an altered level of conductivity in the brain, and so the conductivity is depressed, and that's often treated through drug therapies and through talking therapies. Also on there, you've got persistent depressive disorder. So this, you might see this with the long-term unemployed, for example. You've got postnatal postpartum depression, so following birth. Seasonal affective disorder, which hopefully we're just coming out of the end of winter, but obviously affects many of us in terms of how we feel throughout the winter. And bipolar, which technically isn't a depression, but it is a mental health condition where people go from either being really on top of the world to being absolutely depressed, and they kind of fluctuate between the two. And again, that's often treated through medication and through interventions like CBT and things to teach ways of coping with those symptoms. Actually, you know, it's very unlikely someone will overcome being bipolar, for example, whereas actually some of the other depressions you can overcome.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting point here made by someone about situational based depression. They've been working with an apprentice that's now on to the third employer. The first two have gone out of business, and that person's certainly experienced some of the things you've just described, just simply in the fact that they're worried about the fact they might not complete their apprenticeship.
Absolutely, and there's a classic example of situation-based depression, and going back to the mentor's mantra, they feel insecure, and so that's going to affect the way they perform. Is going to affect much of their life. You know, just the same as a classic example will be, if you think back many years, you know, we all had a time very early on the housing ladder, for example, when we were worried about paying the rent or paying the mortgage in 1 month, and that was kind of overarching. And we found, you know, those thoughts will have crept into other areas of our life. There's a classic example of how, when we feel insecure, it can have a knock-on impact to other things.
Absolutely. And moving on.
So moving on very quickly, so the last one I want to cover was eating disorders. There's two types of eating disorders that you may come across, and anorexia nervosa, so anorexia, which is you're more likely to be aware of, because people with anorexia often, so this again goes back to insecurity, which is where someone has an insecure self-image. So there's something wrong with their body. They have a dysmorphia. They feel that there's something wrong with their body, and so they're trying to control their intake of food in order to get the perfect body. You can see the weight loss. They'll often talk about it. Certainly, I mean, when you get right down to the end, it's really sad, because actually it gets to the point where the body can't accept any more food, and so starts to eat itself. It's really sad, and I've been involved with care of someone who was dying because they'd had anorexia for a number of years, and actually their organs had started to eat themselves. It was an incredibly sad story, but in her eyes, she'd won. She'd got the perfect body, and she was very happy about that. Bulimia, on the other hand, is the hidden eating disorder, and Diana was a bulimic. Amy Winehouse was bulimic, and with bulimics, they go through a cycle of almost binge eating or eating normally and then purging, so making myself sick, making myself vomit, taking laxatives in order to expel it and to punish myself. So because it's a cycle, you'll often see they maintain normal body weight, and that's why it's hidden. You don't see weight loss, because actually Amy Winehouse was a classic example. She has spoken about in documentaries how she used to go on 3-week binges of eating only Haribo for 3 weeks, but then she'd go through another cycle where actually she starved herself and made herself vomit in order to purge the system, and because of that, actually, you know, it maintains the body weight.
Oh, I think there's some key messages coming out from those, and I think that was just Richard, just an example of some of the things. If we move on to the final sort of slides, there's a couple of questions, and if we just go through these general points, Marek, and one point that's come through, which I think is quite very relevant, I think, to almost all of us that are listening in, and that is, and it's something that's actually I was looking at recently. If you're all aware of the evidence pack that supports apprenticeship standards. It's the expectations of the provider and the expectations of the employer. And Helen's brought a very good point to our attention, that in that it also indicates that it's the responsibility, shared responsibility of the employer as well as the training provider to support their apprentices with learning difficulties and individual needs. And hopefully this is something we want to get over, that this isn't just the role of the mentor who comes from the training provider. What about the workplace mentor from the employer? Or if it's only a small business, it might be the employer themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's so true. And actually, one of the things that I was very genuinely surprised about was over the last few months I've had to actually brief offset inspectors about the content of this course for that very reason, because as they go forward over the next few years, they're going to start looking for workplaces picking up courses like this, as well as training providers picking up courses like this.
Absolutely. So in terms of the sort of general points that you want to get over from the session today.
Yeah, I mean, so to sum up, and obviously it's a very complex piece. I've covered in excess of 8 hours worth of the course in the course of about 40 minutes today. But to sum up, it's really important that actually we use the mentor's mantra, that we give our learners the space to be able to talk about what's actually worrying them, whether it's their own finances, whether it's their mum, whether it's their boss, whether it's their approach to work, because actually, when you're doing pastoral support, it's about being heard and understood. Every person has a unique experience of mental health. Mental health, someone can have mental health problems without having a diagnosed mental health condition. Likewise, someone can have a mental health condition but have really good mental health because they've got some good coping mechanisms in place. An example would be after the awful London bombings in July, the 7/7 bombings, what we found was that the people with the best support network, the community around them, people to talk about, or to talk to, actually were the least likely to suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. And part and parcel of our role, obviously, is going in to support our apprentices, is to be that necessarily. So do look underneath the behavior, especially if it's a performance issue. Look underneath and try and see the emotions and what's causing it. And honestly, if you are concerned about learning, if you want to talk about an individual case or something like that, get in touch. Certainly, there are the general threshold we'll talk about referring through a GP, for example, or to a therapist, would be if it affects their daily quality of life. So for example, if actually a phobia or an anxiety or something like that is actually affecting someone's daily quality of life, that would be the threshold, the trigger for us referring through to a professional service. But if you ever just need some advice about a learner, please just get in contact.
And I think a couple of things that come up there. First of all, Richard, I think is a key message there is that many of our assessor, tutors, workplace mentors will find that this is very useful, but they will have to know the limits of their own competence or confidence. So it's obviously being able to refer it. And I would think if you're coming from a large training provider, refer it to the learning support team, who might obviously then be able to bring in a third party where it might be required. But Helen's also raised an interesting question. I think it's vastly important that we know when to support and when to refer. And that's really to make sure that we look at all the safeguarding protocols. Do you cover these on the training as well?
Yes, absolutely. So broadly speaking, we sort of spend 2 to 3 hours in different modules talking about where that level is, because actually it is important as part and parcel of safeguarding yourself as well as your learners, that actually you recognise where that limit is. But likewise, one of the biggest issues we have with support for additional needs and for particularly mental health is that actually low-level mental health is done by all of us. It should be day-to-day stuff, but there's a real stigma around talking around our emotions about our mental health experience, and the only way to address that is by actually starting to talk about it. And like I've put in that slide, actually, what you'll find is even if you can't help, the fact that you've listened, the fact that you've been there, often will have huge impact for that learner.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much then. So Marek, if you could just put up Richard's contacts there. I think we've got them. So if anyone from today, well, thanks very much. A really great opportunity, and thanks very much from everyone. If you want more information, obviously, there's Richard's contact details and the phone number of his organisation, and I think you can also contact Richard on and his organisation on Facebook and Twitter. We really want to thank you, Richard, and despite this technical problems we've got, which I don't know how we'll have to solve those, but nevertheless, I think it's great that we managed to persevere. We'll really want to thank people for the questions. We've got, I think, a couple of. Have we got any more questions, Marek, that are coming through? I've managed to pick most of them up.
I think we have, but yeah, good opportunity now. If there are any final questions or any thoughts, please feel free to share them now using the question or chat facility. Or if it's quick, I can quickly activate a microphone for you. And indeed, if you're watching this on the video recording, hopefully it has stirred up some thoughts and questions. And please get in touch with Richard or ourselves, and we'll be happy to help.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Thank Richard. We'll make sure that everyone gets copies of the slides. But do you want to just put on the last slide just for us to tell people where this fits into the series?
For sure. Just to let you know that when you do receive the slides as well, where you see the Twitter and the Facebook icons, they are actually links to the Twitter and the Facebook feeds, just in case you're unsure.
And you can see that, Richard, we've got another session with you on the 17th of April, haven't we?
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that's looking at mentoring styles, isn't it?
Yes, so that's looking at you as a mentor as opposed to your learner.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and that's going down. And there's a great comment here from Karen. Can employers be offered this course as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, great. And we've got a lot of thanks, by the way. Thanks from people who said great that we've addressed these issues for the first time. I think that's good. That's good feedback as well. And I think, Richard, that we might be looking at a further series on tutoring in apprenticeships, which you've got there. I think that you might want to. We might do that as a double act as well. So that will be good.
Absolutely.
We've got lots of positive things. We just closed down the recording then. So we'll thank everyone for the questions. Thanks very much, Richard, for your inputs in the course of today. And we'll turn off the recording now.
Oh, sorry, I'm just about to do it. I'm catching up and typing away in the background there. Okay, so I'm just about to close the recording. Again, everybody will receive a copy of the video recording with the slides when we finish. And again, if you're watching this on the video recording, please get in contact. Thank you.